present to me.
Jill, then.
Yes, that's correct.
Jill.
Please state your full name.
Gillian Jane Marie Kenney.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Jill, you're here to give evidence about your late father, John, and you were the youngest in the family,
Yes.
with two older brothers.
Mhm.
Your dad was in the army as you grew up. Where in the world did the family live while he was in the army?
We were based in Aldershot first. My father was in Libya when I was born in 1965, and we were also based in Germany. And my father was based in various places. He served with the United Nations in Cyprus in the early 70s.
And we've got a photo of your dad, if we can show that. When was this photo taken and where?
That was taken in Cyprus, and I think it must have been about 1970.
While he was serving with the UN.
Yes, whilst he was with the United Nations.
In 1976, the family moved to Essex when your dad left the army. But 1977, your dad went to Saudi Arabia for work.
Yes, he did.
How often did he return home?
He used to come home about 3 times a year. So he would always try to be home at Christmas. He would usually try and get home at Easter and in the summer.
But you remember him phoning home every week to talk to you?
Yeah, he would phone and talk to myself and my mother. My brothers had both left home by the time we moved to Essex. My older brother was in the Navy and my other brother was farming. So it was just myself and my mum at home, and Dad would always ring, or we would ring him once a week.
Can you tell us a little bit of what your dad was like as you were growing up?
He was a very warm, kind and funny man. He was very, very much for his family. It was all about his 3 children and his wife. He absolutely adored my mum. He really did. It was all about providing for the family, doing the best he could, which is why he went to Saudi Arabia, because employment prospects in 1976 were not good. So that's why he had to go abroad. It wasn't what he wanted to do, but it was what he needed to do.
In 1979, your dad had some neck problems.
Yes.
Do you remember what was going on? What happened?
He had quite severe problems with his back and his neck, and he had a degenerative bone in his neck that was causing him a lot of problems, and he was referred to see Mr. Bonney. And we came up to London. I can remember it very distinctly because it was December. It was Christmas time. He'd come home specifically for this appointment, and he attended the St Mary's in Paddington. They took a plaster cast of his neck, and I can remember sitting with him while he had this big plaster cast put on from like here right the way down to half his body. And this was so that when he'd had the operation on his neck, it would keep him absolutely still. They made a mould from the plaster cast which would keep his neck in place, because they feared that if he moved after he had had the operation that he would risk paralysis.
He went in to have that surgery on New Year's Eve 1979, and just after the operation he hemorrhaged and became extremely unwell. Can you tell us a bit more what was happening then?
From what I recall, and I was only just 14, so if you know, My brother was home from the Navy on leave with his wife. They'd come specifically because my dad was having the operation to support myself and my mum, and obviously my dad when he was in hospital. And we had a call from the Wellington Hospital saying that he had had a hemorrhage, that he was in intensive care, and we needed to come now. And I can remember going to the hospital, and he was wired up, and he was on he'd been ventilated, and he'd had quite a major blood transfusion at that time. And we were told that we were very lucky that he was in a hospital that had such good ICU facilities.
And that's when he was given blood that was infected with hepatitis C.
Yes.
He recovered fairly well from that operation and from the hemorrhage, and was discharged from hospital.
Yes.
And then returned to work in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's right.
But he still wasn't 100%. He still wasn't particularly well. What was wrong with him?
He would experience tiredness and the cold a lot. You know, we always attributed the fact that he was so cold all the time because he was living in warm climates. But he would come home on leave and he would be exhausted. And no doubt he worked incredibly hard when he was away to do a job that was very important. However, when he came back off leave, he would just sleep. He would fall asleep in the chair.
You've described that he would say it was just jet lag.
Yes, we'd laugh and just say, oh, you know, Dad's come back, you know, he's tired from working so hard, he's got jet lag, he's, you know, let's just let him rest. So we would just let him rest.
And you've said in your statement that you had dinner parties at the house. And what would happen when your dad was there for these dinner parties?
When Dad came home, everybody would look forward to Dad coming home. It was like the big thing, you know, Dad's coming home. Mum and I would plan it with military precision for about 2 minutes after he'd walked out of the door to return off his last leave. But we would, you know, make everything really nice so that when he came home, the house was always, you know, everything, all the food that he liked would be in the house. Saudi Arabia's a dry state, so he used to quite enjoy having a glass of wine and a glass of port. And they'd have their friends round for dinner parties. And by 9 o'clock, he'd be in the chair, absolutely fast asleep. And it became a standing joke that, oh, well, Dad's fallen asleep again. So.
You also began to notice that your dad's stomach would get quite bloated.
Yes, and he was he was 6'2". He was incredibly athletic. He'd done lots of running when he was in the army. He did cross-country running, which we require a lot of stamina for. And he was very fit, but he just used to get this bloatedness in his stomach, and we would laugh and say, well, that's where you've been drinking all the Coca-Cola in Saudi Arabia. And we thought that was what it was all about.
While he was in Saudi Arabia, they thought there might be a problem with his gallbladder.
That's right.
And so 1988, he had that removed.
He did.
But that still didn't particularly help.
No, it didn't solve the problems that he had with his stomach. He always felt quite uncomfortable in his stomach. I think he used to get quite a lot of bile and would generally feel uncomfortable.
Although he wasn't particularly well when he was home, those times of leave were quite precious, weren't they?
Very precious, yeah.
And what did you and your dad get up to when he came back on leave?
I worked in the West End at the time, and I would always try and take at least a couple of days' leave, and we would go and do some nice shopping. We'd always go to Liberty's and have a nice walk in Liberty's and look at night, you know. And he would always buy my mum possibly a Liberty scarf, and we'd go and have lunch. We used to go to the Grosvenor Hotel and have lunch, and we would invariably have a glass of champagne while we were having lunch. So.
And generally celebrate him being back.
Yeah, he was a good, fun person. He just always wanted everybody to have a good time. We would, if my brothers were around, they would come over. We had quite a big house at the time, and they did a lot of entertaining. The children, he had grandchildren. He has 5 grandchildren, and he absolutely adored them. and he would spend as much time with them as he possibly could, and he wanted to have a fun time with them, and that they have the most amazing memories of granddad doing this and granddad doing that. And he also became a great grandfather as well, and they would call him Popper. So yeah.
In the background of that, though, he was just consistently tired and not particularly well. And in 1995, your dad stopped working in Saudi Arabia
Yes.
and came home for good.
Yes, he did. He came back, actually much to our relief, because he had gone back for the first Gulf War. He took the last scheduled flight back to Saudi Arabia and was out there during the first Gulf War doing lots of work. So when he finally did decide to come back from Saudi Arabia for good, we were very, very happy. And I was delighted because I was still living at home at the time, so I was going to be living back with my dad full time.
And he came back partly because of this ongoing feeling of just not being right.
Yeah, general nausea and tiredness.
When he got back, he went to see his GP.
He did.
What happened then?
The first couple of times he went, to be honest, he was sort of just fobbed off, really, in the nicest possible way. And, it's indigestion, it's, could be your back pain, it could be a reoccurring thing where you've had your gallbladder out, perhaps you're not, your body's not processing that type of thing. So he went to Korea in, I think, 96, and he really was quite poorly when he came back. He went to Korea on business, and he went back. We told him he had to go. It wasn't a great one for going to the doctor. It wasn't a great one for being, he coped very well with it. He was quite stoic about it. And we would, my brother and I talked about it, and we persuaded him to go back to the doctor. So he went back to the doctor, and the GP surgery referred him to Basildon Hospital, and he was put under a very, very good liver specialist called Dr. Sabani.
And what was he told by Dr. Sabani?
He had a liver biopsy, I believe, and a number of blood tests, and he was told by, can't recall whether it was definitely by Dr. Sabani or by his GP surgery, that he had hepatitis C, and that they had traced it back because of the sclerosis, the state of the liver. It had to be from the transfusion, contracted from the transfusion that he'd received at the Wellington in 1979, 1980.
So that diagnosis finally came in about 1997 when your dad was aged about 60.
That's right.
What was your dad's reaction to the news?
He was absolutely devastated. He was completely and utterly... He could not understand how he could possibly have this disease. And it was the fact that once he had this diagnosis, he was not going to recover fully. He knew that he wouldn't recover fully again, his full health.
You've said in your statement that you remember him telling you, I'm never going to wake up in the morning and feel better again. It's only going to get worse. I feel sick every day.
Yes, he did feel sick every day.
How did the diagnosis change your family life together?
The dynamics changed quite drastically, actually. I had moved out by then. I was married, and my older brother was living at home because his job had brought him down to this area. And my brother was living with them, and my brother noticed a change in his demeanour, that he would sometimes be unhappy and felt completely helpless regarding his situation, and felt that, he was almost made to feel like it was his fault that he had this diagnosis, and it wasn't his fault. We could never really quite take that away from him, that it wasn't his fault.
Your dad was also made aware of the risks of of infecting others.
Yes, he was, and he was completely devastated. Him and my mother had a very close relationship, and he was concerned that he had passed the infection to her, which thankfully he hadn't. He was fastidious over his cleanliness, and, you know, he was a very proud man, and it made him feel uncomfortable with the diagnosis, uncomfortable that he had contracted this disease.
He underwent 2 courses of interferon and then interferon with ribavirin.
Yes, he did.
How did he cope with those?
I wasn't living at home at the time. I used to go home about once a week. My brother was living at home at the time, and he is a trained nurse. And the effect it had on my father, we've had conversations about it, was very, very distressing, incredibly distressing. He didn't react at all well to it. His pallor changed, his skin went into blisters and had started to fall away from his body at some stage. He used to itch constantly. It would make him sick, very, very sick. However, during this time, he was still working, and he was working full time.
He was absolutely determined to carry on working.
Yes.
Throughout both sets of that treatment. Can you tell us what he was doing?
He was working for a recruitment company. He'd helped set up this recruitment company with another gentleman, and it was very successful. And he was working very hard. When you're recruiting people for construction companies, you're often having to talk to people out of their working hours. So he would be talking to people in the evening. He would be arranging to meet people after their work so that he could interview them and prepare them for the interview for the position that they had applied for or that he'd put them forward for. He was basically headhunting for companies.
The second course of treatment became too much for him.
Yes, it did.
And so tell us what happened then.
Well, we felt actually that it was killing him. He was just disappearing before our eyes. He, as I said earlier, had this itchy skin. His skin was in a terrible, terrible state. No matter what he did, it couldn't. He just felt completely uncomfortable in his own skin. And he was terribly, terribly sick.
And so as a family, I think you sat down with him.
We did. We asked him to stop the treatment because we could see that it really wasn't making him any better. So I'd had a talk with my older brother, and he'd said, this really isn't working. You know, I can see actually it's making Dad worse. He's becoming more unwell. It's killing him. It's actually, this treatment isn't going to cure him. This treatment is going to kill him. And we did sit him down and said, please, Dad, please, can you stop? We need you to stop, you know. We need you here. We don't need you to be made more ill.
And so that treatment came to an end.
That treatment came to an end.
If we go forward to 2005, your first marriage had broken down by then.
Yes.
And you were struggling to find a job in the UK. So you went to work in Hong Kong and then Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And your dad came to visit you.
Yes, he did.
Can you tell us about that visit?
He came out in the October, which is a really good time to visit Sri Lanka because the climate is quite temperate then. It's not raining too much. And he arrived on the Saturday evening. Obviously, he was fairly exhausted from the flight itself. But actually, for most of the week, he slept. I had a nice apartment. It had a nice pool. He could enjoy the warm weather. And he slept a lot and rested. And and we had a very special time. I'd come home. I didn't have any holiday when he was off. Well, he was over there with me. But we used to go out and have dinner every evening. And he went into Colombo and went to the cricket club in Colombo because he loved his sport. He was hugely into his cricket. He'd umpired when he was younger, and so he enjoyed going to the cricket club, and just in the evenings we'd go out and have something to eat, and he would just sleep. I'd go off into work in the morning. I'd take his breakfast up to him in bed with a pot of tea, and just, yeah, but he rested. He rested. And we talked a lot. We talked a lot about his condition. We talked a lot about how his condition would, how he would deteriorate. And we spoke a lot about, how we would cope with that as and when it came.
But by 2005, your memory of that trip is of your dad, you've said, just sleeping basically the entire week, apart from dinner in the evening.
Yeah, pretty much.
You came home for a visit in December 2005, so just a couple of months later, and you felt your dad had deteriorated.
Yes, he
more.
had.
And what did you decide then to do?
I decided there and then that I was not going to continue working out in Sri Lanka. I felt that the distance was too far. I felt that I wanted to be there to support my dad. It was at a time when they really needed my support. My mum was also in ill health. And I really felt that I needed to come home and give them my support and look after my dad.
Your dad's condition continued much as it had been until about 2009, but just to have a picture of what that looked like, could we have document 0466004, please? It's a letter dated April 2007, and if we go to the second paragraph, it's recorded that he seems quite down at present as his appetite is poor and he's getting hangover type symptoms in the mornings. He continues to have quite bad pain, and I believe all these symptoms are due to his hepatitis. Is that what you recall?
Yes, very much so. And he was so tired. He just felt like he had no energy at all, and he would get so upset because he didn't have the energy to do the things that he wanted to do, and he didn't have the stamina anymore to do the things that he wanted to do.
And the pain that's referred to there is abdominal pain.
Yes.
And if we look at the third paragraph, the GP is asking the specialist, I'm really writing to you at this time to ask if his future treatment is to be mainly of a palliative nature or whether anything more active can be done for him. I know when you wrote to me 3 years ago, you mentioned the possibility of a transplant. I should be grateful if you could let me know what you think. There had been some discussion about a transplant in about 2006.
Yes. Yeah.
But by now the GP's just not sure what's happening. And if we look at document 0466003, the first paragraph, this is the response from the hospital. John has compensated hepatitis C cirrhosis. Perhaps almost inevitably he will decompensate at some point, and at that stage, if he was of a suitable age, he would be a liver transplant candidate. However, John's already 70 and therefore falls outside the guidelines, and I expect he probably won't decompensate for a year or two. What this boils down to, as you say, is merely palliative care at this point. I'm observing him on a regular basis to make sure we can pick up any hepatocellular cancers that might develop, chance of 4 to 5% per year, and treat them at an early stage, and to treat any symptoms of decompensation as quickly as possible. That was the situation in play in about 2007. How had your dad reacted when he was told that a transplant was not an option?
He was absolutely devastated. He had he'd actually built up some expectation that perhaps because they had talked to him about it, that could be an option. And when they said no, he said, well, why did they give me that hope and then take it away? He couldn't understand why they would go down that course of, that line of thinking, if you like, or that course of treatment, only just to take it away and just give an outright no. He had attended every single hospital appointment. He had done everything that he was asked to do to look after his health. he'd taken the medication he was given, and he really felt quite hurt.
Because when he went for the assessment for transplant, the reason they said no was because of his age,
Yes.
rather than because of his physical condition.
Yes.
And you've said in your statement, your dad wondered why, if he was felt to be too old, why he'd even gone through the assessment.
That's right. And he felt that too himself.
In terms of the abdominal pain, your dad had quite extensive investigations for that, but there was no clear cause that was found. Your dad also had hemochromatosis, which is when the body produces too much iron.
Yes.
And that was explored, whether that was causing the pain or whether it was that combined with the hepatitis C. And then if we look at the third paragraph of the document we've just had, 0466003, the answer from the consultant to the GP was, with regards to the third question, which is really about his discomfort and malaise, the discomfort's been very heavily investigated as far as going to a pain clinic. I've tried to find a cause for this, and I honestly can't. And I agree with you, it may well be related to liver disease. I have perhaps 3 or 4 of my several hundred liver patients that have unexplained right upper quadrant discomfort. That, as far as the family were concerned, was as much as you knew.
Yes.
Now, throughout this time, only a few people outside the close family knew of your dad's hepatitis C. What was the reaction of those who did know?
Disappointing. A number of people that were told was disbelief. That couldn't possibly have happened. How could they screen all the blood? It couldn't possibly have been infected blood or contaminated blood, or the inclination was that he had done things that he shouldn't have done, and it devastated him. My mum and dad, at the time of my dad's death, were married for 50 years. They had a very close and very loving relationship, and for anybody to even infer that he had done things that he shouldn't have done was very, very, very upsetting. So we closed down and we never mentioned it again. We never told people at all. It wasn't discussed, only within the family.
The insinuation was that your dad had been unfaithful to your mother when he was abroad in Saudi.
Yeah. Sorry, it's really hard for me to say that, so thank
absolutely.
you. Thank you.
Your mum used his hemochromatosis as a cover story,
Yes.
didn't she, to explain
Yes, she
the
did.
frequent hospital visits as a way of saying why he was going. But your dad especially didn't want the grandchildren to know about it.
No.
Why was that?
Because he didn't want them to think that he was ill. They didn't know he was ill. They would notice that he was tired, but they were sort of quite early teenage. They were in their early teenage years then, so they were, it was all a bit blasé about it. We could sort of say, he's, the hemochromatosis makes him tired, or, sometimes it makes him a little bit bad-tempered. But he was never bad-tempered in front of the children. He absolutely adored them. Absolutely adored them.
In 2009, your parents moved to Oxfordshire, and at around Christmas 2009, he was told he had liver cancer.
Yes.
At that point, other members of the family were told about the hepatitis C.
Yes.
Do you remember their reaction at that point?
At that point, really, it was still only close family, and we closed ranks, really, on the whole thing. My dad, we felt quite ashamed by it. It was the whole stigma of hepatitis C. It was drug addicts. It was people who had, done things that they shouldn't have done, and it was just very, very hurtful at a time when he was so poorly. We just didn't really want people to know. We didn't.
Do you remember how you were told that your dad had cancer?
Yes, he rang me, and And he was devastated. And we knew then that once he had that diagnosis that really there wasn't very much more time. And he was so precious to me that I really wanted to just make every single moment I had with him matter. And I wanted to be there for him and for my mum. And I wanted to support him and care for him.
You were especially worried about the timing because you were due to be getting married in the June of 2010.
Yes.
Your dad was also worried he wasn't going to be there.
He was.
So what did he do?
He wrote me a letter. He wrote me a very, very beautiful letter about 3 weeks before I was due to get married. He'd come up in the March to stay with us because we were living in Surrey at the time. And we'd gone to the wedding dress shop with him and my mum. And actually, my dad chose my dress. He had really, really good taste. He had amazing taste. And he was just sat there, and I tried on a couple of dresses, and I was like, not sure about that one, not sure about that one. And he just looked up and put his hand up, and he went, actually, I quite like that one. Why don't you try that one on? And it wasn't at all what I thought I would want to wear. So I tried it on, and yeah, it looked. I felt it looked okay, and Mum and Dad sat and cried. So I thought, oh well, that's the reaction you want. So.
But your dad was there.
He was.
Can you tell us about that?
He was very, very, very poorly. We only had a very small wedding because actually he'd lost so much weight. He felt uncomfortable in his own skin. He was getting cold a lot. His clothes didn't fit him anymore, which was quite sad. He had beautiful clothes, but they were so big on him. He was a tall man, but they would just... And I bought him a hat to wear because he was a bald man and he didn't like the sun on his head. So I bought him a hat to wear. And we had a lovely day, but when we were sat down at the reception, I was sat with him and he couldn't eat at all. And it was the hottest day of the year, that year, and he was cold. And I felt like he couldn't enjoy the day as much as he would have liked to. He didn't make any speeches at the wedding, but he didn't read it, he recited The Owl and the Pussycat by Edward Lear, which he'd done since I was a little girl. We enjoyed reading poetry and we enjoyed music. We enjoyed a lot. We had the very similar tastes in music. So it was very special that he did actually get up and recite that.
The Thursday after the wedding, your dad was admitted into hospital.
He was.
What was that like?
I think very much for myself, I realised that this was the beginning of the end, that this was what it was going to be like now for the next couple of months. And he was in the John Radcliffe Infirmary, and I went up to visit him, and he was on a ward with alcoholics and drug addicts and people that had very advanced liver cirrhosis. He wasn't treated particularly well in the hospital. He was treated as if he was toxic. He felt as if he was toxic. And he shouldn't have been on that ward. He should have been either in a side room where he could have been allowed to have had some dignity. It was particularly hot. He was very, very uncomfortable. He was dehydrated. Where he'd lost his appetite, he wasn't eating anyway. We felt that really they had given up on him, and the care was minimal.
After a week, you decided to bring him home again.
Yes, we did.
Not around this time as well, that your mum felt that his mental capacity had changed. In what way had that happened?
I think he had mood swings. I understand from my mum he could be quite bad-tempered. I know personally that he was terrified that he would hemorrhage and that he would drown in his own blood. And I'm sure that that was playing on his mind a lot. And I think that interfered with his mental capacity to cope. He was terrified that he would die and that in front of my mum, and that she would have to see that. And, you know, she's in ill health herself. And he was so worried about what would happen to his beloved Jan. He was terrified what would happen to her. They had experienced quite financial hardships, and he was worried that she wouldn't have the finances to look after her. And, you know, he was reaching the end of his life, and he had all of these things playing on his mind, which I think really must have interfered with how he was at home.
Your mum's described that by this time he was just very despondent because he couldn't do what he wanted to do.
Yes.
In July 2010, you took your dad out for lunch.
Yes.
Along with your husband. How was your dad then?
He was very, very, very poorly. He couldn't eat, actually. He took a mouthful. He wasn't walking very well. And he'd got himself up and he'd gone to the bathroom, and he was sick because he just couldn't hold anything down. What I thought was going to be a really lovely day actually was very sad. That was his last birthday. I think he knew that it was going to be his last birthday. And I'd wanted to make it special, but he was really quite poorly.
Not long after that, the whole family attended the funeral of your uncle.
That's right, yes, my dad's brother.
And your dad was able to attend that?
Yes, yes.
And you've described that he seemed to be going round to everybody and saying goodbye.
Yeah. His siblings were there. My dad was one of 8. So it was at his brother Joe's funeral, and he hadn't seen his sisters for a few years. And his other 2 brothers were there. And he'd had a close relationship with so Joe had died, and his demeanour had changed quite a lot, and he was just very gently talking to people and just saying his farewells. I drove him back from that funeral. My other brother drove my mum back, and I had some time in the car with my dad on my own, and we talked a lot. He talked a lot about his childhood.
In October 2010, you and your husband went up to see your parents for lunch. You were staying in a B&B nearby.
Yes.
And your dad rang you. How did that conversation go?
That was a really difficult conversation. My dad and I had spoken to each other every morning. I'd ring him or he'd ring me. And he rang me that, and we'd had a very, really lovely evening because he talked about Saudi Arabia, and he'd talked to my husband about what it was like to be in the desert, and, you know, how much he'd enjoyed his career. And that morning he rang me and said, "Are you just off to work?" And I said, "Dad, I'm actually in the B&B down the road." And I just stopped eating my breakfast, and I just said to Troy, "We need to go, and we need to go now," because he can't remember that we're here, and he probably can't remember that we were here yesterday. And that's the first time I'd seen any signs of any memory loss. That's, you know, to that level.
A little later on, your dad lost the use of his legs, and he was admitted into the nearby hospice. And your mum and you nursed your dad there for about 2 weeks before he died.
Yes.
At one point, he rallied a bit, and you threw a cocktail party for him. Can you tell us about that?
Well, he liked a good party, and he'd been in for a week, and he'd fallen out of the bed on the Sunday night, and so all the family were there on the Monday, And on the Tuesday he had rallied, and I just thought, do you know what, this is going to be the last time we're all going to be together, and he's going to be conscious and he's still going to know that we're there. So I said, I think we'll have a cocktail party. I think we'll have a cocktail party. And there was a Sainsbury's nearby, so I went and bought some gin and tonic and a couple of beers. And I checked with the hospice first, and they were absolutely fine with it. So we had some gin and tonics, and his grandchildren were there, and my brothers were there and their wives were there. I was there. My husband actually wasn't there at that time. He'd gone back. He'd come back to London. He'd had to go back to work. And it was just quite a joyous occasion. And Dad, he rallied. And we knew that it was going to be that before people die, they rally a little bit. And we just thought, this is the time. So.
And then on the 31st of October 2010, your dad died peacefully with your mum and family around him. The funeral for your dad was just for family and close friends, but you've said it wasn't the celebration of his life that you had hoped. Can you tell us why that was?
We were absolutely devastated. We were devastated. We actually couldn't quite believe that he had gone, or that he had died. We thought that he was invincible, really. And it was just incredibly sad. It was we were just devastated. My husband carried my father's coffin. He was one of the pallbearers, but we were just... It was very sombre. It was very quiet. It wasn't what we thought it would have been. Probably not necessarily what he had wanted as his celebration of his life, but we were just completely bereft.
And you felt that the hepatitis C had stolen him away from
Yes.
you too early?
Completely. We all felt that he'd been stolen from us.
After your dad died, you and your husband moved to be closer to your mum. How has that been?
Our life has changed completely. We lived in Surrey. We used to go for walks along the river every weekend with our dog. My husband's family is in London. We live very rural, so it's quite tricky to get to everywhere. Everything's a country mile. So we've left Surrey and we've moved to where we are in Oxfordshire, and our life has completely changed. I sometimes feel that my husband has an invisible wife, because I spend a lot of time with my mum, which I am very grateful to be able to do. I really want to look after her because my dad loved her so much. He was terrified that she wouldn't have anybody to look after. He knew the family would step up, but he didn't want her to be lonely, and she shouldn't have to be lonely, because if my dad was still alive, which he should still be alive if he hadn't had the hepatitis C, they should be enjoying their golden years. They should be enjoying a retirement. So...
You've said in your statement that financially the hepatitis C was devastating for your parents. Can you tell us about that?
Because my dad lost the capacity to be able to work such long hours in a career that paid, in a job that paid a good salary, they sold their house and they moved into a rented house, and I really only just realised, probably as a course of this inquiry, that the reason they had to go into rented was because they couldn't get another mortgage, because he wouldn't have been able to get life insurance. Financially, they did suffer quite a lot, and his loss of income, he lost some of his pride with his loss of income as well.
You've described the Skipton Fund payments as a godsend.
Yes, it was. It absolutely was.
Why was it so helpful?
Because it enabled my dad to take a year off work when he still had some of his health. It enabled him to pay off some debts that had incurred. He bought a car, and bought a car outright. They had a car. He'd had a company car, so they bought a car outright. He bought membership for the golf club, although by that time he would say often, I don't even have the energy to lift the golf clubs. But it was still there if he felt like a game of golf. And we went on holiday. We had a very beautiful holiday and made some lovely memories.
Your dad received just the one lump sum with no ongoing monthly payments.
No.
And you feel that wasn't enough?
No, not at all.
Do you want to expand on that at all?
The lump sum was brilliant, but when you're in private rented, you're paying out a lot of rent, and it's dead money. I can just collect my thoughts. My parents weren't aware that as this was compensation, any benefits that they had applied for, that amount of money shouldn't be taken into account. So that money was classed as savings, so they received no benefits. We've since found out as a result of the inquiry that that's incorrect, and that has actually now been corrected with my mother's, with the money my mum now receives. But at the time, it was a godsend, but it didn't last long enough.
Because for a period, your parents' understanding was that the money they'd received from Skipton had to be declared in relation to their welfare benefits.
That's right.
And so they lost out on their welfare benefits because they thought they had to declare
That's
Skipton
right.
fund payments.
Yes.
And nobody had told them
No.
that wasn't the case.
Nobody told them at all.
That's now been resolved for your mum.
That's now been resolved actually this year, just this year.
But while your dad was alive, they effectively were losing out on
Yes.
more normal benefits.
Yeah. And not that they necessarily wanted the benefits. I mean, I pushed them to apply for them because of my mum's and my dad's reduced capacity to work. I felt that they should be entitled to at least council tax, help with their council tax, but there was nothing forthcoming.
And you also say that there should have been more help while your dad was alive, so he could have stopped working earlier.
Yes.
When he was unwell.
Yes.
Those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you would like to say?
If I can just say a few words, I'll just... Excuse me. It's been a privilege to come here today and be called to give evidence on behalf of my dear father. And on behalf of John's family, we would like to thank Sir Brian, Miss Richards, and yourself, Miss Fraser Butlin, and everyone involved in the inquiry. You have all treated us with empathy and kindness. My father was a brave and kind man. We miss his warm smile, his gentle humour, his praise and his wisdom. He did not want to die and was not ready to die. Those of us that are left behind have to live with this. The inquiry will not bring him back. However, it may help to give us an answer as to why his life was taken from him and why he was stolen from us far too soon. Thank you.
Jill, thank you so very much for coming to give your evidence and for the moving tribute you have paid to your father and in particular his great love for your mother.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, our next witness, I think, is Ms. Kay,
That's correct.
as she will be known, and we shall have her at 2:20.
Thank you.
Have her evidence at 2:20.